Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so picking up with Justice League Odyssey, this is interesting. Justice League Odyssey is a very, very intriguing story, just because it's again, like the first story arc. My rule when it comes to new comics is I'll give it like probably 1 or 2 story arcs to kind of see how I feel about it. And when it comes to Justice League Odyssey, it's interesting because like there's on one side of the equation, a lot could come out of this. But on the other side of the equation, pretty much nothing could come out of this. It's got my interest peaked. Of course, written by Joshua Williamson, so no wonder why I like it. But what this does is this initially kind of picks up with Jessica Cruz. Now, in a lot of ways, this is DC's expansion of the Justice League mythos. And those of you guys who were reading DC Comics post-Crisis, which I don't know how many of you guys are old enough to basically have started picking up comics in 1984 or 1986 to start reading forward. If you have, awesome. You're one of the few. But the idea was that post-Crisis, DC only had like you had Justice League International, right? Like it was just kind of a hodgepodge of what in a lot of ways were the unsellables. People who just could not really hold their own comic. And DC just kind of tacked Justice League onto the name and then threw them all under one team. And it actually proved to be resoundingly successful. It was a really, really smart move by DC. And so what they did is they started branching out. So you had like Extreme Justice and different things like that. This is very similar to that. DC's really kind of taking a more gradual approach to it, but it's very similar to that. You have Justice League Odyssey now, you've got the return of Justice League Dark, and then you've got Justice League proper. But with Odyssey, this really kind of focuses on like a space-based Justice League team. And so picking up with Jessica Cruz, again, she's basically at the outer fringes of what's called the Ghost Sector. And what's basically told to us here by Joshua Williamson is that after the events of Justice League No Justice, if you guys remember during that story, one of the first worlds to be attacked was a world called Kalu. And that was basically home to the race of people that Brainiac comes from. And so where that world was saved, essentially like all these different worlds that had kind of been bottled up were effectively like released out there into the universe. But then in turn, we find out during the story that they've all kind of been cordoned off. And so basically what the Guardians of the Universe did after the worlds were released is they were quarantined. And what you have is this giant storm maelstrom that essentially like surrounds the Ghost Sector. Those who try to pass through usually end up getting destroyed, and those who are inside can never really escape. And so it's kind of an interesting scenario because what you end up having here is Jessica Cruz, who's kind of like the lone sentry, really kind of the only Green Lantern from the Justice League, who's able to basically serve around as a kind of sentry for the Ghost Sector, who's also being watched by a guy. Now, that guy who's watching her is exceedingly important, and I didn't catch that the first time around. But when this happens, what you end up getting is basically like a ship of Brainiac being piloted by Cyborg that's just like careening into the Ghost Sector. It literally comes out of nowhere. But this little Justice League team is composed of Starfire, Azrael, and Cyborg. And so it's interesting because with these guys kind of banding together, we don't know exactly why they're here. At least we're not told initially why we're here. Instead, you literally have Jessica Cruz just like, are you guys out of your minds? You're not supposed to be here. And of course, they make their way through the maelstrom and just end up like crash landing on a planet. Now, once they're stuck here, that's when we kind of start getting a bit of an explanation on what's going on. That essentially what's happened here is that somewhere along the line, they've all each felt a kind of tug. When it came to Cyborg, his mother box sort of pinged him, but it was more of like a pull, like, hey, you have to go check that out. That's basically what it was. And then with Starfire, it was the same way, and Azrael, it was the same way. And the question was why? Like, what pulled these guys here? And what we basically end up getting is the return of Darkseid, the guy who was basically watching Jessica Cruz when she was flying outside, and basically sort of like follow the trail of Cyborg and company through the maelstrom and onto this world. Now, the reason why he looks this way, and this is a very important thing that I want to talk about, the reason why he looks this way is the progression of Darkseid. So during the events of Justice League Darkseid War, and we never really got to see what the intention of Jeff Johns was with it, because basically as soon as Darkseid War ended, we went right into DC Rebirth. But during Darkseid War, we basically had the Anti-Monitor versus Darkseid, and Darkseid was basically like killed and set on fire and like all these crazy things, but was reborn as a baby and then taken in by his daughter Grail. And so for a little while, for more than a little while in DC, we had no idea what happened. Like all we knew was that like in DC Universe Rebirth #1, it was like, okay, so Grail's got baby Darkseid, and then we never really found out what happened. It wasn't really until after Greg Rucka's like whole run on Wonder Woman ended, and then things were taken over, that basically like we ended up having baby Darkseid being taken by Grail and literally like killing off like Olympian gods, right? Like killed off Hercules, absorbed his energy, became a teenager, and then killed Zeus, absorbed his energy, and then returned to his current form. But at the moment, we don't really know exactly why he's here. And it's kind of a funny thing, because what he basically says is like, you guys are destined to be the new gods of the multiverse. Of course, a fight breaks out between Darkseid and like, you know, the Justice League Odyssey. Like, you know, we kind of had to see them fight. Like, it's kind of what it it is. Like Joshua Williamson's like, hey, look, you guys probably want to see them fight, so like, here you go. And it's kind of a cool thing, but it's also designed to kind of show where Darkseid resides in the greater scheme of things, at least in relation to these guys. And really, like, none of them really stand much of a chance here. I mean, they're all kind of getting wrecked, but the fight sort of makes its way towards a temple, only for us to find out that this temple is basically giving worship to Starfire herself. And it's kind of intriguing, because with this going on, this is one of the things, there's one big question that Williamson doesn't really seem to answer here, but he also kind of leaves it to the story of the Justice League, No Justice, to kind of tell us that. But what's going on here is basically like, there's a handful of people who are praising Starfire and who view her as their goddess. Now, most of the worshippers here have basically been killed, and we're not going to find out who killed them for a little while, but like Starfire showing up here and meeting like the last of the priests, one of the only people who seems to have survived, she's kind of given an explanation of like, we see you as our goddess. We knew it was only a matter of time before you were going to come back and save us. So like, are you here to basically, you know, reward us for our due diligence? She's viewed as a god. And Starfire herself isn't really even used to that. She's kind of like, I mean, you know, like, I guess, but like, I'm not really a goddess. But one of the little known powers that Starfire has that you don't really see her use all that often is the ability to kind of absorb language into herself, you know, almost kind of absorb a piece of a person into herself, and kind of helping this priest pass, and then you basically like absorb the language so she can read the hieroglyphs. She also absorbs a piece of the priest into herself. Now again, like when that happens, she's kind of infected, but Joshua Williamson leaves a lot of things ambiguous in terms of what's going on. It's just like her powers kind of start freaking out, everybody panics, and they're like, okay, we got to get her to her home planet of Tamaran. Now remember, Tamaran was one of the planets that was confined really by like Brainiac and the Coluans and so on and so forth, so her planet's still there, and it's actually here inside the Ghost Sector. And so now it's a matter of, hey, like we have to find a way out, but if we can't, then we have to get to her planet in order to basically find some way to basically save her or keep her alive or something along those lines. But once they leave and then fly somewhere else into the Ghost Sector, they kind of land on like this derelict world, like this kind of frozen world, and they're basically met with what looks to be kind of like a bandit of sorts. Now, of course, this guy basically says, hey, look, I'm a medic on my home world. I'm here to basically heal you, and I'm here to provide you with assistance and so on, and I can basically heal Starfire. So it wraps up pretty quick in terms of like Starfire being, you know, filled with a plague, because that's basically what he says is, hey, there's a plague that kind of ravages across the Ghost Sector, and that's why she's sick and so on and so forth. It kind of gets wrapped up pretty quickly. But what we end up finding out is this group that Cyborg and company run into, this group they meet takes them to like this technological city of sorts. And what we end up finding out is this is a world that worships Cyborg. And so like their whole argument is, one, we don't know if you're legit, and two, in order to find out, we kind of have to test you, which is kind of interesting because they basically end up like making them fight in a kind of tournament of sorts. But what they're looking for is a particular set of events to unfold. They're looking for Cyborg to basically modify his body and then in turn like take out some force. But that's the whole idea behind it, is the machine could basically adapt to almost anything. The machine could modify itself and by virtue of like its power overcome the challenger, like overcome Azrael. And it's kind of interesting here because there's a religious theme behind it. And we'll find out here in a second, like there's actually a reason why Azrael in particular was chosen to be the guy that he's going to face off against. But when that happens and he proves to be victorious, then he's in turn shown to be like the machine. Like they're kind of like, okay, we believe in your power, we believe in what you're capable of and who you truly are. We follow your path now. And so again, like with that happening, what we end up finding out is that there's a kind of insurrectionist that exists on this planet. And this insurrectionist follows in the path of Azrael. And this guy calls himself like Rapture, as a being who basically swears and says like the machine is not an actual god. And so it was really like as much a ceremonial set of circumstances as it was a test. Like, hey, you have to prove that you're the actual machine, the god we worship. But to do that, you have to destroy kind of like an allegory for Rapture, you know, for this guy who's basically an insurrectionist, more or less, who's literally trying to destroy like our entire religious component, which is kind of interesting here. Now, something else that goes on, this is something that I want to kind of point to, and Joshua Williamson is going to be very ambiguous about this. We transition over to another place in the Ghost Sector, and we're basically met with like Blackfire. Now, this is where things get kind of murky, right? Because when it comes to like DC, because when it comes to really DC Rebirth, because DC Rebirth is blending a lot of things that happened before the New 52 with things that happened after New 52, characters like Cormander, like Blackfire, she's appeared in both. She appeared before DC rebooted and after DC rebooted. And so oftentimes we really end up looking to stories in particular, or lines in stories, things that characters say, in order to tell us like which version of the character it is. And William plays it very, very ambiguous here, because really like Cormander doesn't specify either way. But there are like, when it comes to like the original version of her character from back in the day, she was basically like a bad omen for the people of Tamaran, right? Like it's really kind of, or Tamaran, that's really kind of how it was perceived. On the day she was born, you had what was called the Citadel Empire, which was like this fascist empire that basically like invaded the West City and invaded like Tamaran, and in turn killed like 3,000 people. Not only that, she didn't really have the ability to like absorb ultraviolet rays the way that like Tamarans normally did. And so because of that, she was kind of considered to be like a false queen. Like if she had been appointed to the queen queenship, she would have been like not really a Tamaran. That's how people viewed her. Like she was bad omen and she can't really do what everybody else can. And so she's not really good enough to lead their people. On the other side of the equation, Starfire basically was. And so there was kind of a rivalry. There was actually a lot of hatred that really existed between the two of them. Now, if you go into the New 52, things are a little bit different. What you had was a group called the Blight. Now, the Blight was basically like this sort of race. For those of you guys coming from Star Trek, think of the Blight as like the Borg to a degree. The difference is that the Blight were continually basically breaking down. Like they were literally dying and they were pursuing the secrets of immortality. That basically brought them into conflict, or really kind of brought them across the path of the Tamarans, and literally like that led to like Coriander more or less being sold, or at least it was believed that she was sold by Blackfire. But the fact remains that like there was on both sides of the equation, there was animosity between the two sisters. Now, in Red Hood and the Outlaws, where a lot of that stuff was explained when it came to Starfire in the New 52, when it came to like, Coriander, her sister, and so on and so forth, a lot of that was kind of resolved, and the two of them basically went back to being friends, or acknowledged and Coriander forgave her sister, all that kind of good stuff. In this scenario, like there's still hatred there. They're still basically enemies. Like it's the pre-New 52 version of Coriander. But again, it's not necessarily specified. But basically like Coriander's throwing her lot in with Darkseid. And so that's why things kind of get crazy, because it's like Darkseid basically promises her rule over Tamaran if like the two of them ally with each other. Now, not only that, one of the things we actually find out here is that because this race worships Cyborg, that what they've basically done is created a mother box. And it's kind of a big thing, because remember, mother boxes allow like travel around the multiverse, and really like it could lead to an escape. If they successfully create a mother box and they open a boom tube, they could in turn like teleport outside of the Ghost Sector, and who knows what would happen after that, because we don't know if this race would basically start spreading the gospel and like literally turn like the universe into a holy war. We don't really know if that's exactly what would happen, and there's a fear that it would. And so those who are confined within the Ghost Sector, because they're supposed to be here, technically speaking, they're not really supposed to be allowed to leave. And so what we end up doing is kind of transitioning back over to Darkseid and Blackfire, and literally what Darkseid basically says here is that he set in motion a kind of failsafe should the time ever come when like Apocalypse is destroyed. And so what this plan is, we don't really know specifically, at least not until Cyborg figures it out. And with Cyborg basically like putting his mother box to task, putting his mind to task, trying to figure out what's going on with Darkseid at the same time, everything's kind of popping off, he basically realizes what Darkseid intends to do is to create a new Apocalypse. Now, we don't know why Darkseid wants to create a new Apocalypse, because as far as we're aware, unless it was destroyed during Godhead, Apocalypse is still there. We know that New Genesis was destroyed during Godhead, and then a new version of New Genesis was built. But like, as far as I'm aware, Apocalypse is still around. Like the planet still exists. There's no reason to believe Apocalypse is gone, which really begs the question, why is Darkseid building a new one? Like, why is he making a new planet? And that's why things are kind of crazy, is because then at that point, that with Darkseid, going down into this giant water pit, or whatever it happens to be, and then retrieving something, what he basically ends up doing is showing something called the Other Box. Not a mother box, but an Other Box, a device created by Darkseid, or at least planned by Darkseid for quite some time, and now he's finally able to retrieve it. And that's the truth of why the Ghost Sector exists. The Ghost Sector exists because of the fact that at some point along the line, Darkseid put this plan in motion, and the Coloans somehow became aware of it. And that's why like a lot of these worlds were essentially bottled up by them. As long as they were bottled up and kept hidden, Darkseid could not find them. And then once all those worlds were freed, the Guardians of the Universe immediately acted and said, whoa, if these worlds are freed and they're thrown out into the universe, Darkseid exists, he's back now, he's going to be able to easily track down all these different artifacts and basically like recreate Apocalypse. And so we're going to basically confine all these worlds into the Ghost Sector. We're going to put a giant maelstrom around them so nothing gets in, nothing gets out. We're going to put Green Lanterns around it to guard it, and then we're basically going to keep all these different things from safekeeping so the Darkseid can, one, never rise back to his full level of power, and two, cannot recreate Apocalypse. And so it's kind of a crazy scenario because he's basically been able to pull that off. Now, in issue number 6, it's explained. Like, we basically get an explanation for why, but issue number 6 is not part of the story arc. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.